Good afternoon to everybody. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. I'd like to point out that I'm an experimental linguist who's interested in interdisciplinary research. I'm definitely not an expert in executive functions. I'm here to learn. So I don't have any theoretical or methodological wisdom to distribute. What I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about both adults and children, actually, and I'm going to show an area of language where I think linguists and psychologists can benefit from working with each other. And what I'm going to present is very much work in progress, and I'm aware of the risks that I'm running in doing so. So there will be some of you who will say, where are the data? Some of you who will say, where is the theory? So I'm perfectly aware of the risks I'm running, but I think I have quite a lot to learn from presenting this data to you and from hearing your feedback. So the main points that I'm going to cover today is that I think we should focus on the reciprocal interactions between language and general cognitive abilities. So we've heard a lot about the possible influence of the bilingual experience on general cognition, executive functions in particular. But I think we should also look at the other direction, so how executive functions affect language use. And what I'm going to suggest is that bilingualism might actually change or modulate the relationship or the balance between different components of executive functions. And this, in turn, can affect the processing of particular linguistic structures. I'm going to try to present the data. We have plenty of linguistic data. We don't have enough data on executive functions. As I said, this is more a hypothesis that I'm presenting to you. I am working on executive functions with my colleague Thomas Bach, who will be talking about some of our studies, but I've chosen to focus on language because I think it's a very interesting question. I'm going to raise the question at the end whether the phenomena that I'm going to present are evidence of the bilingual paradox. So the bilingual paradox in the literature has been defined by the contradiction between the fact that we may find advantages in terms of general cognition, but these advantages for language in particular for lexical access, which is slower, smaller vocabulary, and so on. So is what we are going to see evidence of the bilingual paradox, or can we find another explanation? So I'm going to make some assumptions that are far from uncontroversial, as we've realized up to now, up to this point in the conference. The first assumption that I'm going to make is that if you can show that a linguistic phenomenon can be explained on the basis of general cognitive mechanisms, then you don't need a linguistic theory to explain it. Okay, so, and this is one of the points that I hope I'm going to demonstrate. The second assumption, I'm going to subscribe to a model of executive functions like the Miat and Friedman model that includes several subcomponents of executive functions. And as we'll see, I'm going to focus on the balance, the relationship between some of these subcomponents. I'm going to assume an overlap between inhibitory control for language and inhibitory control for non-linguistic tasks. This is controversial. We've heard it this morning from Albert's presentation. So there is plenty of evidence from his lab that the overlap may not be 100%. I must admit that I find this idea of modularity within executive functions a little bit weird, but we'll leave that to future discussion. Other assumption is that executive functions, so individual differences in executive functions and cognitive control, actually affect sentence processing abilities. Okay, and there is evidence about that. There is evidence that there are interactions between language processing and executive functions. What I'm going to say more, in addition to that, is that these individual differences in cognitive control show up more for certain kinds of language processing than for others. So I'm going to show that they're more likely to show up for example, the interpretation and use of pronouns, which tends to be probabilistic, than for other kinds of more syntactic processing that tends to be categorical. So yes, we find interactions, but I think the interactions are much stronger for certain kinds of language processing than for others. Now, what are the phenomena that I'm talking about? And these are the linguistic data that are fairly robust. Let me illustrate them to you. So if you take, I'll start from adult bilingual speakers. So I'm using the term bilingual in a broad sense. I'm distinguishing between early bilinguals, so people who were exposed to 2 languages from childhood, not necessarily from birth, and adult bilinguals, people who grew up with 1 language and then acquired another one and reached a certain level of proficiency. Those are late bilinguals. So if you look at late bilingual speakers of Italian, okay, so people who know Italian, whether they are advanced non-native speakers of Italian, so English, for example, good, proficient non-native speakers of Italian, or native speakers of Italian in a situation of attrition. That would be me, for example, after so many years away from my original community. I was born and raised in Italy, but I've been living in Scotland for more than 25 years. So I'm clearly, in a situation of attrition. So whether you want to call these people ex-native speakers or whatever, we can debate terminology, but it's not very important. So both these groups do one thing. They tend to overextend the scope of the overt pronoun. Now, Italian is a language that allows you to drop pronouns, okay? So unlike English, which is a language that broadly doesn't allow you to do that, although there are contexts in which you would drop a pronoun even in English, but in Italian you can much more liberally drop a pronoun, or you can use it. And the distribution of pronominal forms is not dictated by the grammar, but it's dictated by pragmatic conditions or contextual conditions. This is an important point that I'm going to return to soon. So what these bilingual speakers do, they tend to overuse overt pronouns. They also tend to misinterpret overt pronouns. I'm going to give you an example shortly, but not vice versa. So there is an asymmetry. So they tend to, in a sense, to be over-explicit. They tend to stick in too many pronouns or to misinterpret overt pronouns. But when it comes to using a null pronoun, they use it correctly. When it comes to interpreting a null pronoun, they interpret it correctly. Now, second language speakers do it more than attracted speakers. So the phenomenon is there in both groups, but the magnitude of the phenomenon is different, so it's greater in the second language speakers. Now, let's illustrate this. So if you're a monolingual Italian, and you see a sentence like this, that says, Mario hasn't seen his brother since he overt left, without any particular stress. That's in bold in color just to show you what I'm referring to. The preferred interpretation is that he, overt pronoun, refers to his brother. It doesn't refer to Mario, who's the subject. It refers to the non-subject, okay? This is where you see a difference between bilinguals and monolinguals, because the monolinguals have that very strong preferred interpretation, but a bilingual can interpret an overt pronoun that way, but more often than not, they also allow an interpretation where the overt pronoun refers to the subject. Okay? So what we see is variability, and I think this is important for what I'm going to claim later. We don't see that they always and consistently misinterpret the pronoun. They can sometimes interpret it in one way, but they can also interpret it in another way, which you don't typically find in monolingual speakers of Italian. Now, when it comes to the interpretation of the null pronoun, on the other hand, as I said, bilinguals are exactly like monolinguals. So the same sentence with a null pronoun, so Mario hasn't seen his brother since left, okay? That in both groups, that is quite consistently interpreted as referring to the subject. We have, there are other studies from bilingual speakers who have English and another pro-drop language, another language like Italian, so Spanish, for example, or Greek, or Portuguese, all these languages that allow you to drop subject pronouns. Now, we have data from German as well. Those of you who speak German, German is not a language where you can leave out pronouns, but it's a language where you have a choice of pronominal forms. So you can choose between a personal pronoun and the demonstrative pronoun. And we did a study on second language, very advanced second language speakers of German, as well as native speakers of German in a situation of attrition, right? So resident in the UK. And both these groups do one thing. They extend the scope of the demonstrative pronoun where you would expect to find a personal pronoun, but not vice versa. So we find the same kind of asymmetry. Let's illustrate this. So you have a monolingual German, I won't read that sentence, but you see a sentence there with the demonstrative pronoun there. The preferred interpretation in a monolingual speaker of German is that demonstrative pronoun refers to the non-subject, so the cashier in this example, but not to the waiter. Now, bilinguals can allow that interpretation, but they also allow an interpretation where there, the pronoun, the demonstrative, refers to the subject, okay? When it comes to the personal pronoun, no difference between bilinguals and monolinguals. So another asymmetry in a slightly different kind of language that allows you the choice between pronominal anaphoric forms. So just before we move on, I've talked about attrition, right? So these are people like myself who grew up with one language and then left their original community, went to another country, started using another language on a regular basis. The level of exposure to their native language obviously dropped, okay? So what is it that changes in people like myself? Is it, their knowledge of language, or is it the access to the language that changes? Well, we have some relevant data that we recently published in Bilingualism, Language and Cognition. So my ex-student, Gloria Chamorro, tested native speakers of Spanish who had been long-term residents in the UK, so they were in a situation of attrition from English. And what do? They overextend the scope of the subject, the overt subject pronoun, exactly as I showed you before. But she also tested a group of people who had just come back from a very intensive stay in monolingual Spain. So they were fully immersed, in their monolingual community. They didn't speak English, so they were really back to their original community in a full-time sense. And what she found was that these recently re-exposed speakers actually are intermediate in their use of pronouns between the attriters, the people living in the UK who hadn't been to Spain, and the monolingual controls, the Spaniards who were living in Spain. So this recent exposure had a clear effect on attrition and on their use of pronouns, and partly reversed the effect. Okay? This is important to bear in mind. Now, what about children? We tested bilingual children, in fact, a large group of bilingual children. This is work I've done with my colleague Ludovica Serratrice, older, school-age bilingual children, and we tested two language combinations, so children who had grown up with Italian and English, and children who had grown up with Italian and Spanish. So we wanted to see whether language similarity had, mattered or not. And we tested the Italian-English bilingual children both in Italy, so Italian dominant environment, and the UK, English dominant environment, and we tested them on a variety of linguistic structures. One is the pronouns, just what I was showing you. The other one is another phenomenon that we wanted to differentiate, so the presence or absence of articles with specific or generic plural nouns. I'm going to show you what I mean. And the third was, I'm not going to talk about the third phenomenon. So for the subject pronouns, this is what I was saying. There are differences between English on the one hand, where you have to use a pronoun, regardless of whether you're referring to the same topic in discourse, or whether you are introducing a different topic, you're changing reference, you have to use a pronoun, and those are examples. Italian and Spanish are exactly the same in this respect. So if you're referring to the same topic, you drop the pronoun. If you're not referring to the same topic, so if you're shifting reference, you are using the overt pronoun. So those are the pragmatic conditions that I was mentioning before. For the plural nouns, and with or without determiners or articles, again, English patterns differently from Spanish and Italian. So for English, if you are referring to a generic meaning, so for example, sharks are dangerous animals, you can't use the article. So sharks, the category of sharks are dangerous animals. But if you're referring to a specific group of sharks, then you have to use the article. So the sharks at the aquarium are small. For Italian and Spanish, no difference. In both cases, you have to use the article. So no difference whether you are using a generic meaning or a specific meaning. What do we see in this study? This was a study of understanding, comprehension of structures. For pronouns, we see that both the groups, so both the Italian-English bilingual children and the Italian-Spanish bilingual children over-accept overt subject pronouns when they clearly refer to the subject. So they accept sentences like Paperino ha detto che lui è caduto, Donald Duck said that he fell, where he clearly refers to Donald Duck. So both groups do it, no difference in language combination. Bilingual children in the UK actually do it more than bilingual children in Italy, so the language of the environment clearly has an effect. Younger monolingual children that we had as control actually do it as well. So they don't do it to the same extent, but they also accept redundant overt pronouns when they shouldn't. For bare plurals, the same children, remember these are the same children, completely different picture, because it's only the English-Italian bilingual children who accept ungrammatical plural, bare plurals in Italian. So sentences like in genere fragole sono rosse, which is ungrammatical, a clear effect of English, but the Spanish-Italian bilinguals do not. They are absolutely at ceiling, like the child and adult controls in Italy, okay? So what we see here is that there are cross-linguistic influence effects for generic plurals, but not for subject pronouns. So for subject pronouns, it doesn't matter which language combination you have. It doesn't matter if you're speaking two similar languages that behave in the same way, or two different languages that behave in different way. They both do it. So in both cases, children are over-explicit. Now, first question is, are children and adults over-explicit for the same reasons? Not necessarily, because, we may have superficially similar phenomena, but very different reasons. Let's get into the question, what is the problem with these subject pronouns then? Is it a problem with their knowledge of the language, maybe. So maybe, you know, we're coming back to adults now. Maybe, you know, there is an influence of the other language. You know, many of the studies we did at the beginning had English as the other language. English doesn't really drop pronouns, so it's reasonable to say, well, they're clearly, you know, transferring from English. Maybe, you know, these things are not completely acquired in a second language. Maybe they are lost or they are eroded in attrition. The second interpretation is that this is nothing to do with the actual knowledge of grammar. It has to do with processing factors, and it has to do in particular with the integration of grammatical and pragmatic contextual information in real time. Before we get to the second one, which is the one I want to develop, let's have a look at the first one, which is the, you know, the plausible one. You know, you can say, well, you know, there's an influence of one language over the other, because, you know, after all, English is the simplest language from this point of view. English doesn't have a choice of pronouns that depends on whether you're referring to a topic or whether you're referring to, you know, introducing a new referent. English doesn't bother about that. So it's more economical, you know, it makes sense that it may affect the language that is actually more complex in this respect, whether it's the L1 or the L2. So if it's attrition, what we see is a kind of neutralization of your native distinctions in the direction of an L2 that is simpler, more economical. In L2 acquisition, what you see is a neutralization of the L2 distinctions that are in the target language towards your native, less restrictive language, right? So that's very nice, except that it doesn't work, or it doesn't work as the only explanation. Because in fact, also for adults, we find that the overuse of overt pronouns is attested in bilingual speakers of two identical languages. So languages like Italian and Spanish, Greek Spanish, Spanish Portuguese, languages that have the same kind of pronominal system. So why would these people overuse these overt pronouns? You know, they don't have a reason. They could simply rely either on what they know of the L2 or rely on their L1, or, you know, the two systems work in the same way. What's the need? Where does this phenomenon come from? So again, what's the problem with subject pronouns? We've seen that it can't be the only explanation. Let's explore this one, and this is where it gets interesting for our purposes. So using a pronoun actually requires the ability to coordinate the choice of pronouns with context in a generic sense. So you have a grammar, you know, a language that allows you to drop pronouns, right? Either as a native language or as a second language. But in order to know, as I said before, when it's appropriate to drop or when it's appropriate to use the pronoun, the grammar really doesn't tell you. You have to pay attention to the context. So you have to ask yourself, for example, well, am I talking to something that can easily be understood by both me and you, if I'm talking to you, interlocutor? Or in which case I can drop the subject, or am I making a contrast between the two references, in which case I don't drop the subject, and the same applies to comprehension. So I'm going to suggest that this phenomenon is heavily dependent on patterns of executive functions. This particular phenomenon is particularly dependent on patterns of executive functions. So because in normal use of pronouns, people have to do all kinds of things very efficiently. So for example, they have to be able to inhibit irrelevant mappings. So if I'm attaching the pronoun to the subject, I'm not attaching it to the other potential referent, so that has to be excluded, or that interpretation has to be excluded. You have to integrate changing information, and this is what makes this kind of processing different from processing more categorical linguistic information, which is always the same, and for which we develop very highly proceduralized abilities. Proceduralized abilities are not very useful in this domain, because the kind of cues you have to integrate change all the time. You can't decide to use a pronoun in the same way, for the next half an hour, because it depends on what you are talking about, how the conversation develops, the degree of shared knowledge between interlocutors, and all these things vary all the time. So you have to be able to quickly integrate the cues that tell you to use one pronoun or the other, or to switch from one pronoun or from one interpretation to the other. And you have to update your discourse model accordingly. You see that, these operations kind of neatly correspond to the executive functions in a fractionated model like Miyake and Friedman. Now, could it be the case, let's start from this, could it be the case that because these operations are demanding in this respect, so you have to do this kind of rapid integration, updating, and so on, could it be that bilingual speakers simply have insufficient resources? So, they have to keep their languages separate. We've heard this, bilinguals have to keep their language separately. They have to invest enough resources to avoid interference from the other language. So maybe that takes resources away from this kind of linguistic operations. Now, so there is a competition for resources, according to this simpler explanation. And we are clearly assuming that, these operations and keeping the two languages separate tap into the same pool of attentional resources. And again, this is an assumption that you may want to disagree with. But this might also explain why bilinguals are not consistent in computing these operations. Sometimes they do it, sometimes they don't. So this fluctuation is consistent with the use of fluctuating attentional resources. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. When it doesn't work, there's always a pronoun there, and I'm coming back to that. There is an effect size difference. We've seen this before. So both second language speakers and attrited speakers do it, but to different extents. So could it be that the overextension of verb pronouns is smaller in attrited speakers like myself because you have to apply different levels of inhibition to the other language. So if you're a second language speaker, the unwanted language, if you're speaking Italian, is you're still dominant L1, which needs more resources to be inhibited, leaving fewer resources to do this kind of operations. If you're an attrited speaker, the unwanted language is the less dominant L2, right? Which needs fewer resources to be inhibited, and so that it might leave more resources available. Now, that's a second explanation, a more adventurous one that I want to submit to your kind scrutiny. And this is the possibility that, in fact, it might not just be an update, a simple lack of resources, but it might be an updating problem. So could it be that bilinguals are not consistent in quickly integrating the cues that we'll see before tell you when it's appropriate to use one pronoun and when it's appropriate to use the other one? So if you take production of referential forms, you might think that, for example, production starts from the most reduced form, which is by far the most frequent, by the way. So the null, the omitted pronoun, it's by far most frequent. It has, linguistically is the default. We can say, maybe speakers, have a tendency to start from that. But then, they select a form that can be best understood by the listener if needed. So if there is, a realization that, I can't drop the pronoun because my interlocutor won't understand what I'm talking about, or, conversation has evolved, in a certain direction. So you have to update, you have to switch to an overt pronoun. So maintaining reference, shouldn't be a problem. So if you keep talking about the same referent, you keep dropping pronouns, that should be unproblematic. But using more explicit forms in an appropriate way are, in a sense, more costly. They require mentalizing about the interlocutor. It requires discarding, the less informative forms. It requires updating a discourse model. Now, we have a problem here because, assuming that bilingual speakers are not always able to do that, they don't over-drop pronouns, they actually overuse pronouns, so they are over-explicit. They produce fewer reduced forms rather than more. It's interesting in this respect that other populations where you would expect speakers to drop pronouns more, in fact, they use more explicit form. For example, young autistic people overuse explicit forms, which is the contrary of what you might intuitively expect. Now, it's possible also that bilinguals may have a higher threshold for deciding when, a referent is still salient. So it might be, that bilinguals are more sensitive to salience, and they might decide that, particularly in sentences like that, where one of the antecedents is first, and then there is another antecedent which is, more closer to the pronoun. Well, maybe, they might have, as I said, a higher threshold for deciding that a reduced form is sufficiently clear. And so, they stick in a pronoun to be over clear compared to monolinguals. In comprehension, well, the interpretation of pronouns might start from the most reduced form, the default mapping to the most prominent antecedent. But then, if you hear an overt pronoun, that has to be interpreted as a signal for a shift of reference. So if your interlocutor uses an overt pronoun, that means you have to understand their intention. You have to mentalize about their intention. You have to update your discourse model. And that's where, we see it's done, but it's done inconsistently by bilinguals. So what if there is a trade-off between inhibitory control and the ability to integrate or update? So this is what I'd like your feedback on. I've discussed this with psychologist friends, and I got some good feedback, some indifferent feedback. There is a literature in psychology about these components of executive function being in a potential antagonistic relationship with one another, so that being very good at one, even in a particular task, might decrease efficiency in the other, and vice versa. That's what I mean by a trade-off ability. So what if in bilinguals, and particularly in late bilinguals, there is a trade-off between these two abilities? So bilingualism might actually be an advantage. I'm not quite keen on this term, but let's call it that way, in terms of very good inhibitory control, particularly in late bilinguals, because they have to inhibit their dominant language all the time. And they have to apply much more inhibitory control to their dominant language than an early bilingual who's grown up with two languages. So what if that very good inhibitory control, the other side of the coin, is a less efficient ability to integrate efficiently cues that are in the environment and that are unpredictable, so that change all the time. So, there are examples in the literature about antagonistic relationships between cognitive functions. So, for example, integration of cues in switching requires disengagement from inhibition. We also did a study on negative priming as being the other side of the coin from good inhibitory ability. So the better you are inhibiting, the more you have to recover from inhibition and the larger negative priming effect you have. So these components, interestingly, can be dissociated in a variety of typical and atypical populations. So there is evidence from aging people, there's evidence from autistic people, and so on. So it is possible that one of them goes in one direction, the other one goes in the opposite direction. So what if, suggestion to you, what if early bilinguals and late bilinguals might be different in this respect? Not because these tension is not there for early bilinguals. It is there. But early bilinguals have an executive function system and a processing system that developed together with the two languages in a way that it's optimally suited to using two languages. And that's different from a late bilingual who grew up with an executive function system and a general processing system that is optimally suited to one language, then they add another language. So early bilinguals might manage that tension, that trade-off relationship better, more efficiently than a late bilingual. And that's why we see the phenomenon more prominent in late bilinguals. So I'm arguing that the bilingual experience might actually have different effects on the balance between different components of executive function. So on the one hand, you might have enhanced inhibitory control. On the other hand, you might have less efficient modulation of inhibition and integration of cues as the other side of the coin from enhanced inhibitory control. And early bilinguals might be better at adapting their attentional control, their attentional system to solving that tension depending on the task they are doing. Now, is there any evidence of that? No, well, not really. So I want to mention a couple of studies we did which might bear on the question, but not with the relationship with pronouns, which is still to be explored, but on the possible trade-off relationship between components of executive function. These are two very recent studies that I've done with my colleagues in Edinburgh. Thomas is here. So in this study, we had early bilinguals and late bilinguals. And we tested different components of executive functions by means of the test of everyday attention, and we controlled for a bunch of variables and so on and so forth. These three subtasks are one where you have to count the tones. So the test of everyday attention is an auditory test. So in the first test, you have to count tones, and that measures sustained attention. So it's a kind of baseline. If people are not able to count tone, if they're not paying attention, then you can probably remove them from the sample. The second subpart involves counting only the high tones, but ignoring the low tones. So that tests selective attention. And the third part, you have to pay attention to a cue that tells you whether to count upwards, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or whether to start counting backwards. So if you hear a high tone, you reverse the direction of counting. So if you are at 6, you start going 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So that tests selecting, updating, and switching. So you have to pay attention to the cue, incorporate the cue, change your behavior, update your mental model of the problem accordingly. The results are that there is no group differences. We have monolinguals as well as controls, no group difference for the baseline, as you might expect. Early bilinguals are better than monolinguals, both for the second part and the third part. For the late bilinguals, we find that the advantage over monolinguals is much more prominent in the second, so selective attention, than in the third. The effect is much weaker in the third part. But in a more recent study that we published in Cognition, we find that in university language students, both the second and the third component of the test of everyday attention, we found an advantage, an effect on language students of the bilingual experience in a university setting, on both 2 and 3. So the evidence is still pretty inconclusive in this respect, and I don't have any problems acknowledging that. So, interim conclusion, bilingual speakers are not monolingual-like, right? Both in their L1, in their use of pronominal forms, they are either in the L1 or in the L2. They're not radically different either, but there are some specific differences that we keep finding. This phenomenon can have both a linguistic side and a cognitive side. So the cognitive side that I'm suggesting doesn't have to do with a particular language combination, but simply with the fact of being bilingual, the fact of having more than one language in the brain. Now, these differences, and this is where I'd like to, sort of open a brief parenthesis on terminology. I would prefer to call them effects because, they can be seen as advantages or disadvantages only if you take the monolingual norm as a point of reference. So, what I presented, if you take that monolingual norm, is not an advantage. I mean, it's a disadvantage, right? But, François Grosjean was the first one who taught us that perhaps bilinguals are not the sum of two monolinguals, right? So perhaps the monolingual norm is not, we shouldn't always, we all do it, right? A sinner as everybody else, but maybe that's not the right kind of thing to do. I also want to present briefly a slightly different account that doesn't rely on these different subcomponents of executive functions that, according to some people, well, for one thing, make finding experimental evidence much harder, right? And finding enough conditions and participants and controls. What if we have, an alternative explanation that requires a more sort of unified account? So rather than, fractionating executive functions in this way, we take into account the whole attentional system. And in this respect, we might want to say that maybe the balance that we're talking about is the balance between what Braver and then Morales and other people who've applied the concepts of bilingualism, the balance between proactive and reactive control. And if we're taking this tack, what we're saying really is that bilingualism actually requires some kind of reconfiguration of the cognitive network that ends up affecting both linguistic language use and non-linguistic processing. And that's why we find a convergence between attrition and acquisition. Now, convergence that I've tested in two different groups, different populations. What we need to do is test these phenomena in the same individuals. So you test them both in the L1 and in the L2, and you test them from the beginning of the bilingual experience, so to see how it is possible that the degree of convergence between L1 and L2 might actually be a predictor of success in a second language. So, in other words, this mutual influence between L1 and L2 might be a desirable thing, because it might mean that you're better able at reconfiguring your cognitive system in such a way that you can handle two languages efficiently, whereas if you remain rigidly monolingual in your native language, you may not go beyond a certain level in a second language. So, in fact, attrition effects, rather than being regarded as a negative side, they may actually be a positive indication of successful late bilingualism. Now, there are many open questions, and I'm coming to an end. There is variation in monolinguals too, okay? So, and in fact, if you look at psycholinguistic studies of the use of pronominal forms in monolingual Italians, what you see is that the variation is largely restricted to the overt pronoun in Italians. Not the null. The null is not a problem. The overt can be. Sometimes people can't be bothered to do, what my ex-colleague Fernanda Ferreira would call good enough processing. You can't be bothered to do sort of full encoding of things or full interpretation, and you end up overusing pronouns or misinterpreting pronouns. Now, if we take a simple, remember the first account, the simple lack of resources account, that might predict that if you put monolingual speakers under pressure, they might actually start overextending over pronouns as exactly like the bilinguals, right? So that one might be a prediction. If you take a reconfiguration account, on the other hand, you may not predict, differences between monolingual. You might predict differences between monolinguals and bilinguals, because monolinguals, by definition, haven't undergone this reconfiguration of cognitive processes because they have only one language. To go back to the question, I showed you results from children and adults. Well, they do the same thing, but do they do it for the same reasons? Well, let's remind ourselves of one thing, that all bilingual children, certainly the vast majority of bilingual children that get studied in the literature, get input which is affected in two ways. They get exposed to a parent who is an ex-native speaker of the language. So my children, for example, were exposed to my Italian, which is affected by attrition, and so it's not the same kind of input that I received when I was growing up in Italy. They also get input from a second language speaker of the same language, so they get quite a mix of different influences that are very rarely looked into. So when we see the same phenomena in bilingual children, we have to ask ourselves, does it depend on developmental factors, the fact that their executive function system is still developing, as well as their linguistic system, the fact that they are exposed to variation in a different kind of variation from monolingual children, etc. Inhibiting languages, I've talked about, the need to inhibit language, but is that the same thing as inhibiting particular structures? So again, I'm not inviting to modularize executive function, but I'm just asking whether, well, I'm sure that we would have to use, maybe different kind of tasks that tap, that are sensitive to these different things. Because one thing is to inhibit a whole language, one thing is inhibit a subset of that language, a particular structure that might be relevant for what you're trying to say, but you want to push it out of the way. So I'm concluding now. I think that I've presented many hypotheses that still need to be tested. I just want to get your reactions about whether whether these are completely outlandish ideas or whether there is some mileage in this. I think that in general terms, we need bridges. So that's why I said at the beginning, interdisciplinary research is definitely the key to understand, to improve our scientific understanding of bilingualism. And I'd like to remind you of another thing, if I may, that there's more to bilingualism than just executive functions. We're all in love with executive functions, well, some of us. We are here to discuss executive functions. That's a very important aspect of research, but it's not the only one. I do a lot of public engagement work. I talk to people all the time. I hear questions from people all the time. Well, there are many aspects of the bilingual experience that have been studied extensively. This is one. It's very interesting and so on. But let's not make the mistake to think that bilingualism and executive functions is the same thing, because, what is it that hinges from our reply to the question, is there a bilingual advantage or not? Well, certainly not the whole of bilingualism, I can tell you. Thank you very much.